So I'm going to be talking about the federal budget deficit. So what is the federal budget deficit? The most basic definition of this term is when the government is spending more than the amount of revenue that is coming in. And this is especially apparent this year, but I'm going to talk more about that later. And just for reference, the projected deficit for 2020 is about $3.3 trillion. So a little bit about the history of the United States federal budget surplus or deficit. This graph shows the years 1941 to 2020, and I thought this was interesting because it shows that we have definitely been in deficits in the past. Nothing compared to this year, but it shows only one noticeable surplus, and that was in the late 90s to early 2000s. And the first noticeable deficit was during World War II, which makes sense since there was a lot of additional spending on military at the time. And we can notice that as the years go on, the margin of additional spending from the government broadens. As I said in the previous slide too, the projected deficit for this year is about $3.3 trillion, which is about triple what it was last year in 2019. So for the effect COVID-19 has had on this year's federal spending, it would definitely be an understatement to say that it has not been bad for so many reasons, especially financially. The CARES Act was a stimulus plan that was passed in late March and was worth about $2.3 trillion. This money was allocated to different areas as to benefit the most people possible. $350 billion went to the Paycheck Protection Program, the PPP for short, for small businesses as a loan so they could continue to employ their workers or pay their rent or for utilities or something like that. And that was for an 8-week period that has since ended. $1,200 went to low to middle income individuals with an extra $500 for each of their kids if they qualified. Unemployment benefits were extended an additional 13 weeks, along with an additional $600 per week. $150 billion went to state local governments. $117 billion went to hospitals and veterans' health care, specifically to adjust to the requirements of COVID, such as safety measures, testing, etc. $500 billion went to the Treasury for aid to industries hit hard, like airlines, for example, as well as nonprofits, states, and cities. Then there was also additional spending on certain programs, like $25 billion going to food stamps, $24 billion for the USDA, and $10 billion for the post office. And the whole purpose of the CARES Act was to provide relief for individuals and businesses that were hit hardest by COVID-19. So many individuals lost their jobs and therefore their income. Businesses had no choice but to fire the majority of their employees and receiving minimal revenue compared to prior years. And any sort of additional money from the government was definitely greatly appreciated and utilized. And while $2.3 trillion is an enormous amount of money and definitely made a difference, it is still unfortunately not enough to keep small businesses afloat, for example, or for individuals who are struggling to pay rent. And we can see the effects of the CARES Act is actually starting to wear off, and the momentum is slowing down as we further distance ourselves from when it was passed in March, and as we enter record high COVID cases right now across the country. So U.S. states are also being hit hard by COVID-19 and therefore are struggling immensely. In the Wall Street Journal article titled U.S. States Face Biggest Cash Crisis Since the Great Depression, written by Heather Gillers, it is talked about in detail how much states are suffering even though they received $150 billion through the CARES Act, that is not nearly enough, not only to make up for the loss of money from tourism and those kinds of benefactors, but also from a loss in tax revenue, which I will talk more about in the next slide. These major deficits that states are facing has forced them to implement major cuts in vital areas such as education, correctional facilities, and parks. And there's also been a major decline in the total amount of state government employees, dropping hundreds of thousands since February. And these massive deficits have also forced states to dip into their rainy day fund, if not use all of it. These funds have been accumulated over years and are there as a sort of backup in case there's a major shock. So for a scenario like the one that we are in right now. This has its own problems though, since that is a pretty last resort option, and building back up that rainy day fund would take years to do, especially after the effects of this year. For example, in Connecticut, they responded really early when COVID started rapidly spreading in the US. So they implemented the lockdowns and social distancing pretty early in comparison to other states. But this also had a very negative effect on their financial situation. It's almost like they acted too fast, and their economy paid the price, resulting in a loss of projected revenue of $8.4 billion through 2024, which is more than twice their rainy day fund, which they've been accumulating for over 3 years. Another example is in Michigan. Chris Kolb, who is the state's budget director, stated a pretty drastic statistic, saying if he eliminated 12 state departments, including education, environment, and treasury, and used up every penny in state reserves, Michigan would still be short $1 billion needed to balance his budget. And that was a direct quote from the Wall Street Journal article. And that really shocked me, and I think really shows how serious states are struggling right now, and also really puts into perspective how much the states are trying to benefit their people as much as possible without having to cut more money from vital programs like education or Social Security or Medicaid, and worsening their deficit. I feel like schools have been especially hit hard. When I was reading this article, I saw that there was a school district in Ohio that is barely meeting ends meet due to the loss in state funds, and any money they received from the stimulus package has already been used to purchase new technology and cleaning supplies. In reading about this and how much the students have struggled really emphasizes the fact that COVID and how much of a deficit our country is in has restricted the usability to learn, for example, which is particularly unfortunate. So on this slide, I included a graph of the change in tax revenue across all the states. States are extremely dependent on taxes for revenue, with sales and income tax making up about 60% of states' revenue for general operating funds. But both of these have declined sharply due to the impacts of COVID, so there have been major job losses as well as a fall in consumer spending. And even though people are definitely still buying products and putting money into the economy, it is nothing close compared to the pre-pandemic levels of consumer spending. So we notice in the graph that there have been declines in the past, one directly after 9/11 happened, one during the recession of 2008, and one this year. And these projections also do not include a potential second stimulus plan or that restrictions get worse. And this article was also written at the end of October, and the amount of COVID cases and deaths have gotten exponentially worse, with states and counties implementing curfews and lockdowns again. So I would guess that the projection for this year has gotten even lower, or will in the future. So in conclusion, COVID-19 has had such a negative impact on the stability of our economy, and I think it is also important to mention that the entire world is going through this and suffering. Some countries more than others, but it is definitely impacting everyone. And while a deficit is never good, especially one of this magnitude, the economy will bounce back eventually. Even though the thought of that happening seems like a very distant possibility, it will happen eventually. What is more important right now is making sure that our most vulnerable citizens and businesses receive the support they need to survive this grim time in our lives. We can see in this chart that we had a large deficit in result of the 2008 recession as well, but we managed to break through that. What's most important now is working on a second stimulus plan to aid those greatly struggling. Economists and Federal Reserve officials agree that this is necessary to restore growth and that we can worry about the deficit when COVID slows. William Hoagland, who is a senior vice president at the Bipartisan Policy Center, stated, "Unprecedented times call for unprecedented deficits." While this is an unfortunate reality, it is important to understand that this year has been like no other, with numerous challenges besides COVID. Stabilizing the economy, getting people back into the workforce in some sort of capacity, and making sure that people are able to just literally survive this pandemic is what is really important, and we can work to close the deficit when there's not a deadly disease claiming more and more lives with every passing day. And here is my works cited. Thank you.